When Vladimir Putin decided to invade Ukraine, Belarusian dictator Alexander Lukashenko was quick to hitch his country's wagon to the Russian war machine. Just stick with Putin, Lukashenko thought, and the war will be over in weeks, and Belarus will benefit from being Russia's only direct ally. Only that hasn't happened. The Ukraine war has dragged on for years, and Belarus has started to suffer. An alliance with Russia has devolved into the country being on the verge of losing its sovereignty. Belarus is imploding as Putin's war is destroying everything, and worst of all for Lukashenko, he never saw any of this coming. It wasn't supposed to be this way. Lukashenko has for decades been a shrewd political survivor who's managed to stay in power even when the odds seem to be against him. For decades prior to Putin's invasion of Ukraine, Lukashenko had also proven himself adept at staying on Russia's good side, while also placating the West with promises of a democracy that would likely spell the end of his presidential reign. This approach made Belarus, for all intents and purposes, a neutral country before the Ukraine war. Lukashenko threw that neutrality out of the window when he decided to support Putin in his Ukraine invasion. Belarus allowed Russia to use its territory as a launching pad for the initial invasion, and, as the Financial Times reported this September, even played a part in Russia's campaign of Ukrainian child abduction. Lukashenko even agreed to host Russian nuclear weapons on his country's territory, even after years of promising that he would never do so. But there was a logic behind these decisions. Like many, Lukashenko assumed that Ukraine wouldn't be able to stand up to Russia's military might for long. Ukraine would eventually collapse, Lukashenko believed, and when it did, Belarus would be there to reap the benefits of having allowed itself to become something of a puppet state. But Ukraine defended itself well, and Belarus felt the pain. So closely tied had Belarus become to Russia that the two countries' economies started to mirror each other. As the war dragged deeper into 2022, which was far longer than Lukashenko ever expected, Belarus's economy contracted by a startling 4.7%, prompted by it becoming a target for the Western sanctions that would otherwise have been reserved for Russia. During the same period, Russia's economy also struggled. According to Statista, Russia's gross domestic product, or GDP, declined for 12 consecutive months between March 2022 and March 2023, hitting a monthly low point of minus 5.1% in June 2022. The die has been cast. Whatever happened to Russia would now affect Belarus. Though this tumultuous first year of the Ukraine invasion sent shockwaves through Belarus, a recovery was on the horizon. The rebound started in 2023, and it was faster than anybody could have foreseen. Russia needed more weapons to continue the Ukraine war, and Belarus was all too happy to provide. Cash injections from Russia followed, propping up the country's ailing economy. The war became a blessing for Lukashenko, albeit one earned thanks to a dreadful war, and his country's economy experienced 4% growth in both 2023 and 2024. The war may not have been over, but the good times were rolling. However, to achieve those good times, Lukashenko has transformed his country's economy into one reminiscent of the Soviet era. That was great for Russia. Belarus has essentially become a feeder nation that was dependent on Russia for its survival. However, for Lukashenko, a problem had emerged. What was supposed to be an alliance that benefited Belarus had instead started to drain the country. The vampiric Putin and his never-ending demands started to have a massive impact, not only on the Belarusian economy, which is now inextricably linked to Russia's, but also on the nation's very sovereignty. Belarus now finds itself in serious trouble of collapsing to the point where Russia will gain full control. And one of the most surprising signs of that trouble comes in the form of something that almost every person watching this video will have somewhere in their kitchen: potatoes. In June, Politico reported that Lukashenko's Russia-friendly economic approach had the unexpected consequence of plunging Belarus into a potato shortage during the spring of 2025. The carb-loaded vegetable is a staple of the Belarusian diet and a product that is grown in high volumes within the country. Yet, Lukashenko has implemented strict price controls on the product to the point of encouraging people to snitch on grocery stores that broke his price rules, Politico says. In the process, he made potatoes less valuable for Belarusian farmers to produce, which means they did what anybody would expect them to do. They switched to other products. In 2024, those farmers harvested 3.1 million tons of potatoes, which was down over 900,000 tons from the previous year. A shortage was the result, and the cracks started to show in Lukashenko's dictatorial facade. In August, IntelliNews reported on a Lukashenko rant from the previous March, which took place during a cabinet meeting held to explore why Belarus had failed to put a stop to soaring potato prices. "You didn't do it, and you'll answer for it," Lukashenko roared at his cabinet. "It turns out we don't have potatoes. How much has the price of potatoes gone up? Can't we produce the right amount of potatoes, put them in the cellar, and then sell them to people? Why? It doesn't store well. I warned you last year how it should be stored. I gave you the example of Shulayeko from Alexandria. They built a storage facility. God forbid I drive by there and stop there and it's not filled to the ceiling." This almost unhinged rant offers just a small glimpse into Lukashenko's mindset. He knows that he's a leader who's losing control, and whether Lukashenko wants to admit it or not, Putin is going to be there to pick up the pieces. That point will be returned to in a moment. Now, during the first 3 months of 2025, the price of one of Belarus's staple products, which the Financial Times says is referred to as the country's second bread, rose by 10%. As this was happening, Lukashenko was demanding that his country's farmers grow enough of the vegetable for both Russia and Belarus, attempting to exercise a Soviet-like control over what he seemed to want to turn into state-owned farms. But Belarus isn't a Soviet country. What it has become is a country that's now so tied into the trials and tribulations of Russia that every decision it makes is tinged with the question: what would Putin think about this? Of course, potatoes aren't the be-all and end-all of Belarus's woes. They're just a symptom of a much wider economic problem under which the country is now labouring. The overall cost of living has risen to the point where the average Belarusian is struggling. Though grocery stores still carry other staples, such as bread and milk, inflation is racking Belarus to the point where these necessities are quickly becoming unaffordable. Trading Economics highlights that the country's monthly inflation rate hasn't dropped below 5% since November 2023, and that rate was 7.2% in August 2025. The BEAAR Trust says most of this inflation seems to be centered around food. In July, when the rate was 7.4%, the cost of food went up by 10.6% compared to the cost of non-food products rising by 3%. On top of Belarusians being increasingly priced out of eating, transportation costs have rocketed up, which makes moving goods through the country more expensive. Consumers bear the brunt of those higher costs too. Sanctions are also feeding into the cost of living crisis, which, as mentioned earlier, wouldn't have been a problem if Lukashenko weren't so adamant about being joined to the Russian hip. Belarus also has a labour shortage. Job vacancies available in the country are declining, reaching 198,000 by the end of August. However, there simply aren't enough workers to fill these vacancies, especially as Lukashenko has transformed Belarus into a wartime economy to feed Putin's war machine. The situation has grown so desperate in Belarus that Lukashenko is trying to push through a controversial plan where he invites up to 150,000 Pakistani workers to Belarus as a short-term fix for the problem. Is all of this sounding somewhat familiar? It will for anyone following what's happening with Russia's economy. That country too is experiencing a labour shortage. Inflation in Russia is even higher than in Belarus, and the cost of living is becoming unbearable for the average Russian. What happens to Russia now happens to Belarus, at least on the economic front. And that extends to the economic contraction that followed the bumper growth of 2023 and 2024. Yet, as the war has dragged on, the potato shortage has been just one of the problems mounting for the Soviet-style economy, the Financial Times explains. Lukashenko has struggled to get a grip on high inflation, and there's a scarcity of workers. In the first half of 2025, GDP growth slowed to 2.1%, though it remains well above the pre-war level. Sure, that's still growth, but Belarus expected GDP growth of 4.1% for 2025, and that simply isn't happening. Euromaidan press paints an even grimmer picture of Belarus's economy. And again, it all comes back to the country's links to Russia. There's been an 8.1% drop in farming, the outlet explains, which is likely linked to the potato issue discussed earlier. Belarusian exports to Russia have also fallen by 70%, which is terrible for a country that relies on Russia for 60% of its trade turnover. Growth is slow, and Belarus is now in the difficult position of seeing that its support for Russia is leaving it with no alternative for propping up its ailing economy. Lukashenko threw all of his eggs into Putin's basket, and Russia's leader is now keeping those eggs for himself. Nowhere is that more evident than in the emerging oil crisis inside Belarus. Between August 13 and August 19, Ukraine's drones struck the Druzhba oil pipeline several times. This huge oil artery transports Russian oil to Europe, but its northern branch feeds into Belarus's oil refineries. The oil supply provided by this pipeline was cut off, leaving Belarusian refineries with no crude to work with. There was an almost immediate response. Fuel cost in Belarus rose by 8%, adding to the cost of living woes already discussed. Queues started forming at gas stations, and the country's farmers, who were already dealing with income issues, weren't able to get their hands on enough fuel for their equipment. Lukashenko tried to keep his people calm, but the shortages were enough to get his people riled up. Belarus was in a moment of need, but surely Russia would step up and help out, right? After all, it's only because of Putin's war in Ukraine that Belarus was dealing with all of these problems in the first place. After all that Belarus has done for Russia since that invasion was launched, Russia would surely help it to overcome what Lukashenko hoped would be a short-term fuel crisis. Of course, Putin is far too self-serving for that. Rather than helping one of his major allies, Putin ordered Russia's oil companies to start buying as much oil as they could from Belarus. Ukraine's pipeline strikes have extended to Russia's refineries, meaning that as Belarus faces a shortage, so does Russia. Belarus's refineries were forced into the catch-22 situation of trying to increase their supplies as they were dealing with a slowdown in the Russian crude needed to make those supplies. By August 25, the pressure had become too much to handle. Ukrinform says that Belarus has been forced to restrict supplies to Russia, both to ensure that its own citizens have the 2 million tons of gasoline used in Belarus annually, and because selling to countries like China and India is more profitable than selling to Russia. One could take this small act of rebellion as a sign of a lingering divide between Russia and Belarus. However, far more important here is what Russia's reaction to Belarus's oil crisis meant to the country's people. It was a betrayal, an example of how the country on which Belarus now relies so heavily will serve itself when it suits Russia to do so. The combination of the myriad economic issues Belarus now faces, combined with Russia's response to the country's oil crisis, reveals that Lukashenko has placed his country far too deeply in Putin's pocket. So deeply that Belarus has essentially become a puppet state, and, if it isn't careful, could be even in danger of imploding so severely that it loses the one thing that Russia doesn't currently control: its sovereignty. Concerns about Belarus losing its statehood and becoming part of the Russian Federation were being raised by Al Jazeera back in January 2025. It said that Lukashenko had become a hostage to the dictatorial system he created in Belarus, which is a system that can only be maintained because he has the support of Putin. Even as far back as the late 1990s, Lukashenko seemed hell-bent on reintegrating Belarus into some warped version of the Soviet Union. The Financial Times also points out that it was only thanks to the protection offered by Putin that Lukashenko was able to tighten his grip on Belarus to the point where he can crush dissent and win presidential elections. As exiled former opposition leader Sergei Tikhanovsky tells the outlet, if it weren't for Putin, he, Lukashenko, would be long gone. That desire for integration into Russia, which for so long granted Belarus concessions from Russia, has now become the noose around Belarus's neck. All that Russia has to do is pull, and that noose tightens to the point where Belarus itself is lost. Chatham House highlighted these emerging problems back in December 2023. In an article penned by its Belarus Initiative Director, Dr. Rihor Astapenia, it said that Lukashenko's policies have strengthened himself at the cost of weakening Belarus. Military integration, in particular, has become so widespread that it's simply part of everyday life in Belarus today. Lukashenko has put his country in a position where it will be unlikely to ever say no to Russia if Putin decides he once again wants to use Belarusian infrastructure to attack Ukraine. In a September 16 interview with Times Radio, former UK military intelligence specialist Philip Ingram made a similar point about the pitfalls of Belarus's military integration with Russia. Speaking about the Zapad 2025 joint military exercise between Russia and Belarus, which was held on Belarusian soil, Ingram made the point that Lukashenko has placed his country's sovereignty at risk.
By formalising having more Russian troops within Belarus, eventually probably we could agree that Belarus is almost partially fallen to Russia anyway, and therefore probably going to fall.
In other words, the clock is ticking. Zapad 2025 hasn't helped things. What was supposed to be a display of combined Belarusian and Russian military power has instead become an opportunity for Russia to further normalize its maintenance of a military presence inside Belarus. The operation, which Ingram says involved around 10,000 Belarusian troops and 4,000 Russian soldiers, was much smaller than previous Zapad exercises. That alone should be concerning for Lukashenko. It means the exercise wasn't about the anti-NATO power projection that has been in the past. Instead, Putin may have been using Zapad 2025 to send some messages. To Ukraine, Russia is saying that it attacked via Belarus before and it could again. But to Belarus, the message is much different. Zapad 2025, Ingram says,
also demonstrates that Russia eventually will take Belarus, and the more often its soldiers are in there, the more it just gets used to them being around.
It's essentially an invasion in all but name, and it's one being conducted under the guise of an alliance. All of this is compounded by moves Russia's been making for decades that strengthen the military ties between Russia and Belarus. Way back in February 2000, almost right at the beginning of Putin's reign, Belarus announced that Russia had agreed to extend its nuclear umbrella to Belarus. That was the start of a slow-burn military-focused strategy that led to things like Russia using Belarus to invade Ukraine, the Zapad exercises, and in August 2025, Putin's proud declaration that Russia will be stationing its new hypersonic Oreshnik missiles in Belarus. While Lukashenko might want to think that these are all signs that Russia wants to protect Belarus, the reality is that Putin basically sees the country as part of Russia, and if Ingram is correct, will eventually absorb Belarus into the Russian Federation. But this was all part of Lukashenko's plan. After all, he's the one who's worked so hard to integrate Belarus into Russia. That suggests he would happily cede control to Putin should Russia's leader decide he wants it. Well, no he wouldn't. At least that's according to Astapenia, who tells the Financial Times there's a popular myth that he has no sovereignty at all, that he's even less authority than the Chechen strongman Ramzan Kadyrov and is content with it. That's not the case. At times, Lukashenko's room for maneuver has been broader, at others, like in 2020, it nearly disappeared, but he's never stopped wanting to widen that space. Lukashenko was trying to use Russia as a tool to prop up his reign, all while he attempted to conduct a balancing act that also made Belarus seem at least a little West friendly. Belarus's president failed in that balancing act when he offered his country support to Russia for its Ukraine invasion. Now, the Financial Times says he's trying to claw some of his power back. There are several hints of this. The decision to limit refined oil sales to Russia, mentioned earlier, is one of them. The Financial Times adds that the mood in Belarus switched during the summer, once again making Lukashenko more willing to deal with the West in ways that are sure to anger Putin. Lukashenko has started considering the release of Belarusian political prisoners, likely as a way to get some sort of sanctions relief from the West. One European analyst, who the Financial Times doesn't name, also claims that Lukashenko has invited him to Belarus several times in what he says is a demonstration of Lukashenko's desire to reopen lines of communication with the West. Since Trump's inauguration, Lukashenko has met with US Deputy Assistant Secretary for Eastern Europe Christopher Smith 5 times, he said in an interview with Time magazine. The Financial Times says, in June, a visit by the US presidential envoy for Ukraine, Keith Kellogg, to Minsk led to the release of Tikhanovsky, who was driven at high speed to the Lithuanian border with a sack over his head. Having been frozen out by the West for half a decade, Lukashenko is now trying to claw his way back into the West's good graces. He has to. Putin showed him with the oil crisis that Russia sees Belarus as a country that exists to serve the Russian Federation. Any illusions Lukashenko might have held of having a somewhat equal partnership have shattered. Now he's left with a country that stands on the brink of an economic crisis, all thanks to Russia. But much worse than that, Lukashenko has put Belarus's sovereignty and his own grasp on power at risk. That was all part of Putin's plan. The question now is, will Lukashenko be able to stop Belarus from imploding, or are his recent efforts to get back on the tightrope between Russia and the West a case of too little, too late? Perhaps knowing that Belarus is slowly turning away from him, Putin is looking to other countries to help him with the Ukraine war. One of those nations is another tightrope walker, Turkey. Putin is begging Turkey to provide air defenses that Russia desperately needs. Find out more in our video, and remember to subscribe to the Military Show for more videos covering the latest developments in European geopolitics.